the heart of the prince comes in the second half, when Machiavelli takes aim at the so-called princely virtues. Stuff like liberality, mercy, trustworthiness, religiosity. He argues that you only need to appear to have these. You only need to pay lip service to them in order to achieve and keep power, mantenere lo Stato, but the actual embracing of them might in fact cost everything that you're trying to keep, which is a curious, somewhat jaundiced view of politics, but it is certainly one that has caught on, you could say. It boldly embraces, endorses, and legitimizes hypocrisy, quite frankly. And he says this quite clearly. Because I know many have written on this topic, I fear that when I too write, I shall be thought presumptuous, because in discussing it, I break away completely from the principles laid down by my predecessors. But since it is my purpose to write something useful to an attentive reader, I think it more effective to go back to the practical truth of the subject than to depend on my fancies about it. And many have imagined republics and principalities that never have been seen or known to exist in reality, for there is such a difference between the way men live and the way they ought to live, that anybody who abandons what is for what ought to be will learn something that will ruin rather than preserve him, because anyone who determines to act in all circumstances the part of a good man must come to ruin among so many who are not good. Hence, if a prince wishes to maintain himself, he must learn how to be not good, and to use that ability or not as required. That is straight up utilitarianism. That is again, a bold embracing of hypocrisy. And saying it doesn't matter. Do what you have to do, because the world is not an ideal place. This is a thorough rejection of the Platonic tradition, of the tradition of idealism, of the teachings of Cicero, the example of Cicero, any notion that a leader needs to be above all good and needs to aspire to preserve justice above all else. This is not that. This is somebody having the straight practicality to say justice is irrelevant. Don't aspire to be just. Aspire to power. Justice is a vague term and has really never existed in the world except in compromised human forms. So why pretend that you can achieve it? Why focus there as your goal? Well, you could recall back to the earlier part of the Prince, when he says that, well, you should be as an archer and aim high and let gravity and the natural forces drag down your aspirations. But here he is saying something just a little bit more naked. Just a couple of points in this. His standard here is what is practical, what is useful. And here you see a very real humanistic instinct in him about not aspiring to the ideal, but dealing with what we can handle, with what we can find in our world, in the human world, not the ideal world. This is not utopia. This is a realpolitik position. Later, political scientists will come along and name it realpolitik. It is about not trying to be good, but trying to be effective. And this is realpolitik has evolved to be a theory of international relations where you don't where you deal with the world that you find, and leaders come into power and they find that they have to make certain compromises of their morals, certain compromises of their ethics, and notions of justice just fall apart when you are dealing with the complicated world as it is, which isn't surprising on a global scale. Morals and ethics are going to be somewhat different from standard to standard, from nation to nation. And it is unrealistic to expect that people from different heritages will have the same notions of what is just. But that is also an indication of Machiavelli's project here. Machiavelli is saying that, well, okay, to be realistic, to be successful, you need to put aside idealism. That is a very attractive notion for the Prince of Ambition, for the prince who wants to crack out of narrow provincial terms and perhaps get a realm, a princedom, somewhat more global, somewhat more universal, where you are starting to gobble up more and more identities, where the simple homogeneous character of a society will start to expand. And so the notion of morality doesn't fit. The notion of a single identifiable ethics cannot fit, because you're taking in other traditions. So think about the appeal that he's making here quite nakedly to tyrants, to people with ambition to take over the world in various realms or various ideas. Certainly, this has been extrapolated to that. He wasn't quite talking, I believe, about global domination or anything. He's not a Bond villain here. That was, this is the early days of world exploration. I don't think even he could imagine that a single prince could conceivably conquer the world. But he was talking about a known world in a more Alexandrian sense, where you start with what you know and you start to push out from there. And maybe you get pretty far, but you're never going to really conquer the whole world. But it is a statement of ambition that I think he's proposing here, and one that would be very attractive to a group of people who've recently returned to power in a small area and are looking to expand and swallow up more, like the Medici. It is a brazen celebration of the kind of avariciousness that the Medicis frankly practiced. But again, this causes us to step back a little and say, well, that is very conspicuous in its immorality, in its unethical, unmoored orientation. By saying that, is he in fact satirizing or caricaturizing, at least, the Medici ambition? Are we meant to read that and lean back and be a little horrified by it? It's kind of horrifying when you think about the potential. But this is undoubtedly the frame of mind that the Medici were finding themselves in. And he would be playing to that while simultaneously warning everybody with this that it's something to watch out for. He's not playing to a general audience. Remember, this text survived in manuscript for more than a dozen years. So he was playing to a fairly small coterie of people, but it's exactly those coterie, those institutional men of politics of the time, who would perhaps be able to rein in and resist the avaricious tendencies of the Medici at the top. the deep state, if you will. Um, the question of morality is at the heart of the humanist experiment, though. Morality is either man-made or it is imbued by a idealist instinct. Um, However you really want to orient that. But he is arguing that it is something to be re-examined. It is something to be reconsidered and seen less as a gift from God, as a pure and fixed system, a fixed notion of what justice or ethics could be. And once it becomes a human thing, it is open to some question, some consideration, some reevaluation. And maybe that's what he's saying that we need to do. Maybe he is saying that there is, in fact, a purpose to this, that is a purpose to ethics, that is inextricably human and needs to be reaffirmed and not just considered vaguely, but needs to be an active debate within society, within individuals, so that perhaps in debating these things, in considering the virtues of ethics, human beings would then be able to draw their own conclusions that perhaps what the Medici are doing and what all of these other princedoms around Europe at the time are doing in trying to conquer one another and consolidate power and expand power. Perhaps what they're doing is in fact wrong. And no matter how many blessings from the Pope they might get, especially if the Pope is in the family, like the Medici, no matter how many trappings of morality or institutional sanction, individuals have the power to question, to say, that's not right, that's not safe. Again, with Machiavelli, he's playing it so cagey. There are so many different possibilities to interpret this that it's hard to really come down and say, this is what he means. Because he is a consummate politician above all things, and he's not going to let himself be defined, because good politicians don't let themselves be defined. They define themselves, and then as circumstances change, they tend to redefine themselves to fit the times. We'll get more to that. Chapter 16, he takes on the notion of liberality and stinginess or parsimony or cheapness, if you will. And here you get into questions of taxes and government funding and all of this. And he takes on the idea of, well, one way to buy, well, literally buy support from your people is to spend lavishly on them. You make friends by showering them with goods and services and bread and circuses and all of these things that, oh boy, this is great. But Machiavelli tells you to, well, think down the line of that. If you keep doing that, eventually you're going to go broke. And then all of these people who have been fed on all of the goods and services of the government are going to find themselves saying, hey, wait a minute, the well's running dry, but I am used to this. So now that guy who is giving me all this stuff, and I like them for it, now I hate him for it because he got me used to it, and now I can't have it anymore. Or somebody is giving me all of this stuff and paying for all this, and eventually the tax bill comes due and those big taxes start coming, and hey, the people suddenly say, I don't want to have to pay this. So he says, well, again, the Machiavellian code, play it both sides. He says it is desirable to be considered free spending, liberal, in the classical liberal sense. But practicing this, obviously, is more of a vice than an extravagance, is a vice of extravagance, rather. You can't spend forever. So, in effect, make it seem like through a few very carefully selected expenditures, make it seem like you're very generous. But in fact, be a little stingy, be a little miserly, even. Make it seem different than it is. Put on a different face. This is, again, a core Machiavellian value. Make it seem one way, but do it another way. It's curious. On 17 is one of his most famous chapters, one of the most famous ideas, where he talks about cruelty and mercy, where he speculates on, well, the core question of, is it better to be loved or feared? For Machiavelli, fear is greater than love. For a leader, while it's nice to be loved, and you should try and, again, appear that way, lovable, being feared is better. Think back to the whole story of Ramiri del Orco. Fear works. And having people in that little uncertain place of not knowing whether to be fearful or not, that has its advantages itself. When people are praised for mercy, they're actually showing stupidity in Machiavelli's calculation. You don't want to become known as a softy, so to speak. If a town is captured and its leaders are allowed to live, those same leaders might rebel, gather their forces, and cause destruction of the entire town through just the fighting in general between the two, or force the original prince to come in and put down the rebellion by just decimating everybody. And that could have been avoided from a utilitarian standpoint if you just came in and said, okay, the leaders of the resistance here, we're just going to kill all of them right away, and then everybody else is going to go on their business. So then you're just killing the leaders of the resistance and not everybody. Utilitarianism. A prince ought not to be troubled by the stigma of cruelty, acquired in keeping his subjects united and faithful. By giving a very few examples of cruelty, he can be more compassionate than those who, through too much compassion, allow disturbances to continue, from which arise murders or acts of plunder. Lawless acts are injurious to a large group, but the executions ordered by the prince injure a single person. Utilitarianism. It is better to be loved than feared. Or is it better to be loved or feared, or the reverse? I answer that a prince should wish for both. Again, remember the Ramiro de Orco thing, where having it sort of in between. When people are in an ambiguous state, an uncertain state, they are much easier and pliable for managing. And this is how Machiavelli argues. Again, however, you have to ask the question, is he being ironic here? Is he saying that, well, yes, because everybody is, everybody should be terrified, this is a good, or this is a recognizable signal for the general population to recognize what is a tyrant doing, and where is tyranny going on that creeping scale that it tends to evolve through. Is fear used? Is the use of fear the characteristic manipulation, of terror, the sign of a great leader or a creeping despot. By highlighting this, he's giving his readership a sense that, okay, yeah, when things start to go south in your society, that's when leaders tend to rely on fear. By pointing this out, he is empowering his readers to judge for themselves that, oh, okay, now I just have to watch for when people are afraid. And if people are afraid on a regular basis, that means bad things are coming. It's a subtle hint. Maybe it's not a hint. I don't know. But again, that question of irony, that question of who's he really speaking to here? Who's he really writing to here? He is managing, as a politician, to write right in the middle so that everybody comes to this to make their own interpretation, which is humanism. Because he's not, while he is handing this to an authority figure as a guidebook for authority, he is in fact empowering everybody in his readership, if not the society at large that it trickles down to ultimately. But he is advising everybody to come to this and draw their own conclusions for it. There are just enough ambiguities in here that it's impossible to avoid drawing your own conclusions about a number of things. That's humanism. Not relying on the authority telling you what to believe, but rather to draw your own conclusions based on the evidence you see. Chapter 18, honesty. Princely virtue. Honesty. Should a prince keep his promises? Should a prince honor his word? Once again, of course, appear to have the virtues, but it's not really necessary to actually have them. You don't have to keep your word. A prudent ruler, therefore, cannot and should not observe faith when such an observance is to his disadvantage and the causes that made him give his promise have vanished. Honesty and faith. Faith to your word, faith to the Catholic Church. Not so sure. Honesty is questioned in leaders. Leaders always, politicians always extol the virtue of honesty. But here he's saying, honesty, schmonesty. Is that dangerous? Is that evil? To use a more loaded term. He leaves it up to you. He's just saying, well, it's useful. Again, if you have to lie to your people to keep the peace is ultimately in their best interest, so lie to them. It works. Dishonesty. Deliberate, specific, used with skill, with virtue. It's a sign of a great leader. 19, on avoiding contempt and hatred. Once again, cultivate loyalty among the populace. Do this through whatever means you can. Not because of some great ideal that you want to serve them, but through the idea that they will keep you in power so that you may continue to serve them. Mantenere lo Stato. The people will gather around you. And here he's really pitting a couple of different entities against one another. For the prince, for the head of state, he's dealing with a fairly striated society where there are the general populace, but then there's also the aristocrats. The aristocrats are where the prince tends to have all of his problems because they are all fairly ambitious and usually well connected enough that they pose a threat. They can, and throughout history have, launched rebellions, overthrown princes, and caused a lot of trouble. And there is a historic and very well documented throughout history tension between those entities, between the prince and between the aristocrats. And so Machiavelli is saying, okay, keep the people close to you, make them love you, even if it means stirring up the animosity of the aristocrats because they are not your natural friends. The people, on the other hand, you can gather to you and use them in a sense as a kind of human shield, where the aristocrats will not be able to raise an army against you if all of the people who would compose an army love you. That's not a, that doesn't have to be a genuine love, but it's an effective one. It's a strategic one. It's a practical one. Sincerity is an ideal. Sincerity is almost irrelevant. You don't have to love your people. You just have to hold them close. It's a cold hug, if you will. And Machiavelli suggests that princes do what they can to keep people close and to push off the unpleasant details as best they can, or unpleasant tasks as best they can, on others. To have somebody who is blamable, a fall guy. Princes should have others carry out hateful tasks and reserve the pleasant ones for themselves. Every politician in the world practices this. Oh, you didn't call me? My assistant screwed up. You called, but my assistant didn't patch you through. Yes. Oh God, they're terrible, aren't they? Again, remember Ramiro de Oro. He brought in somebody to quell a rambunctious population, and then when that person had basically broken them, but had stirred up a lot of animosity in the practice of it, well, he just killed Ramiro de Oro. That's for the ugly people. Let me do the fun stuff. I'm the good guy. Those people are the bad guys. And those people, for the Medici, would be all of the other aristocrats, all of the other young challengers. If they're the ones always delivering the bad news, if they're the ones always doing the unpopular things, nobody's going to like them, and they will not be able to gather any power around them. I conclude, therefore, that a prince need not pay much attention to conspiracies when the people are well disposed to him. But when they are unfriendly and hate him, he must fear everything and everybody. Think of the paranoia in that. Think of the anxiety in that. He must fear everything and everybody when people start to turn on you. That's terrifying. Feeding paranoia, feeding the sense that everybody's out to get you, feeding that Machiavellianism, that can trip a moderate prince into a tyrant like that. But again, it's that sense of the political mind, always looking around, not trusting anything. Trust and friendship and love and justice and public service. These are all ideals that have no bearing in human politics. And Machiavelli is saying that, don't trust in the idealism. Don't trust in what is not practical and useful and expedient to the time. Don't trust. It should here be observed that hate is gained through good deeds as well as bad ones. Therefore, as I said above, if a prince wishes to keep his position, he is often obliged not to be good. For if that large body, whether made up of people or soldiers or grandees, whose support you believe you need to maintain yourself is corrupt, you must feed its humor in order to satisfy it. A good prince needs to tolerate corruption. A good prince shouldn't go in and try and, oh, that person is stealing, that person is bad. But maybe they're good at their job. You need to tolerate that. You need to just go along, because the outrage to your ethics is beside the point. If that large body is corrupt, you must feed its humor in order to satisfy it. Go along to get along. Deal with it. Don't clean house. Don't insist on high ethical standards for anybody. Okay, this is the world as it is. This is reality. You are not to pine for a reality that never was, but rather live within the reality you find. That is humanism. And think of the fatalism of that also. The fatalism of Machiavelli's position. Again, always be careful with biography, but especially with a character who is so known for lying and who seems to have no problem with lying and who says, I don't mind lying. But consider his place where he has lost everything. He has found himself exiled and on the opposite side of the very people whom in the past he has been somewhat duplicitous towards and who have some reason to resent him. And he is now essentially begging for their approval, for their support, for their permission to re-enter society, which is what he loves. He hates being stuck on a farm. He hates being outside the thrust and parry of political debate, of intrigue, of his identity as the inside man. He's begging for permission to return. And he knows the Medici are dangerous. He knows the Medici are in many ways corrupt. So here it sounds almost like he is making an excuse for himself. Take the world as it is. They're in power. I will seek to help them. This is my independent judgment. This is my humanist right to reject universal notions of morality and say, well, those people just don't understand. I am entitled to my own perspective. I am entitled to my own justification. I don't know anything, any abstract notions of what justice or morality or ethics may be. I am here because I can justify it.